Well, it's time. We're finally going to paint up the last of the three main Avengers. Thor, firstborn of Odin. Wait a minute. That's not right. Now we're going to paint up Thor, god of hammers. Wait a second. Now we're going to paint Thor, god of thunder. Yeah! Greetings. Welcome back to Mediocre Minis. It's now time. We're going to paint the last of the big three, the main three, the first three, whatever, of the MCU, Thor, god of thunder. Now during this, we're going to be doing a few things different this time. First, I'm not going to be using much wash on the miniature like I have in my previous videos. Second, we're going to be doing something a little bit different with his hammer, staff, you know what I mean, and try to create a glowing effect to it that will make it seem more realistic. So, with all that said, let's turn around, and let's get started. Alright, so we're going to be using blood red, mountain stone, gunmetal, brown leather, red leather, and birch for our base coats. Now first you can see here I have the model for Thor already primed and zenithly highlighted, which you can see in some of my previous videos. I'm starting off by taking one of the gray colors and darkening up just a little bit so that I can later go back in with some highlights as I cover the majority of the miniature in the gray. This is to somewhat symbolize Thor's armor. For most of the time it is mostly gray. One of the harder parts I found with painting Thor is there's just so much gray and not nearly as much accents. This is very similar to Iron Man in some way, but at least he has a little bit more of the gold. Then I take some of the red and I paint it onto his cloak. I also get the front and the back of the cloak just in case if somebody decides to take a look at him from behind. I mean, it's Thor, why wouldn't you? I'm also using a darker shade of red here so that later on I will be able to use some highlights on it to brighten it up. And finally a bit of black on the gun as well as some other areas. I use a blade steel or just a silver color to accent some of his armor, such as where the spiky bits are, and also the emblem on his chest, and the halo with the skull over top of his head. Some of this is actually a little bit difficult due to all the nooks and crannies where paint can potentially go, and it really takes a lot of time to make sure you cover every area completely. Luckily, I was very particular about this, so I didn't paint everything gray and then have to re-base coat it later on. Definitely helps to have a paint plan, which is something I learned after doing the Captain America model. And as usual, parts of it are out of focus because I still don't know how to film anything. And there we have a nice base-coated Thor. Next I move into some panel lining and I use the same black as I used before. It is a ink. Now of course you can use black paint for this if you wish. Of course ink flows off the brush a lot easier for me, though it is a lot less forgiving and it's a lot easier to make mistakes, which you'll have to eventually go back and do. But due to how easily it flows, I find that the black ink works very, very well and shows up very nicely in all of the bits and pieces between his armor, and really helps to give some space and some definition to all of his gear. Of course I do end up going back to correct some mistakes because my brush control isn't as good as it could be. One of the things with power armor is there are lines and divisions everywhere, so it does take a lot of time to make sure you get every single bit lined that you want. This includes around the boots, his belts, and of course the pack on his back, which most of the time I end up having to go back and do because sometimes I just forget different bits of it. I also make a lot of mistakes on the pack, which I end up having to correct later on with some of the darkened gray. I also like to fill in some of the eyes for the skulls, just to give them a little bit more depth and to show where the eye sockets normally are. Now I move on to some highlighting. I use tarnished brass, polished silver, shadowed stone, which is a lighter gray, and also a different shade of red to help bring out the areas of the cloak. I also do a little bit of base coating with the brass on some of the emblems and medallions that are hanging from Thor, as well as highlighting some of the skulls. Now I didn't use a wash here for the cloak. What I end up doing is just not hitting the recesses, but some of the higher areas of his cloak, and this is a way you can almost skip the wash step and actually move straight on into painting. You start with a much darker color or darker shade, and then you just add on brighter hues and tints over top of it, and that's a way you can actually get around doing a wash. Both work, though they are a little bit different process to do things. And here I take some of the lighter gray, I mix it in with some of the darker gray at first to give some highlighting and some shading to all of the gray armor. In some areas I actually do this a few times, getting progressively lighter and lighter, moving up to the lightest gray that I have in some of the areas such as the top of the shoulder pads, on top of his backpack, also on some of his legs, just to show where the sun would hit the most from these areas, giving it, some of the brightest look. This does take a little bit of time, again, since I didn't wash the model. This is a few extra steps and also helping out finding all of the areas that would be brighter. A nice trick that I find when doing highlights this way is you actually just take the model and look at it from the top down. If you can see it from the top, there's a good chance you can use some extra highlighting on that area. And now I go in with some of the silver and giving some highlights to the edges of all of the silver areas on the armor. With something so small, you can actually just put the individual brighter shades on top of each other, and you won't really notice the difference in the transition. This is called layering, which I will hopefully cover in another video eventually, going over what layering is and how you can properly use it. But it's a very fast and easy method for blending. Then I go in and I highlight with the silver on some areas of the gun, such as the symbols on the side and the sights. Since I already painted this black, it does take a few coats of the silver to fully cover it up, but in the end it ends up looking really, really nice and crisp. And then finally I use some edge highlighting to go around the areas that were painted with a base coat of gunmetal. Some of the highlights I make a little bit too thick, as you can see on his kneecap, where it stands out a little bit too much, but in the end I ended up liking the thicker highlights, so I left them there as opposed to going back and correct them. Though you can make them as thick or as thin as you like. However, most of the time thinner is better, but in this instance I decided, yeah, that's fine. Thor does carry a book on his back, because I guess he likes to read, and that's how he learned how to speak Groot. And then I use that a different shade of a tan, so I also do that in the purity seals and to show off the pages for the book. I wonder how long it took to learn how to speak Groot. Counting the only words are I am Groot, it must have taken a long time. I guess that's where he carries a book with him, just in case he runs into the Guardians of the Galaxy. And with a lot of the base coat and highlighting done, we're going to move on to the staff. And with the staff, we're going to be doing something different. Now for the staff, we're going to be doing something called Object Source Lighting. It's also called OSL for short. Now what this essentially is when you have an object that is glowing. It could be fire, it could be a gemstone, a crystal, or in this case, Thor's staff, hammer, and it will act like it's projecting light onto the miniature. This is a really nice way to show that something's glowing other than just painting the object itself. So what we're going to be doing is taking some more of the blue ink, and we're going to be applying it to areas of the miniature, such as Thor's face and some of the armor, to give an idea that it is actually glowing and the staff is giving off some sort of light on itself. Now, I will make note that this is the first time I'm ever doing something like this, so we'll see how this goes, but this is kind of a tricky task to pull off. So let's see what happens. So for the staff, I'm going to be using some blue ink, also some paints, Mediterranean blue, sky blue, and Caribbean blue. These are all used for the staff and also to create the OSL effects. What I first end up doing is using the blue ink to cover the area where I want the staff to start glowing from. Now, normally with ink it is a very intense color, but also relatively transparent, and it would take many layers to get to the opacity that you wish. However, despite how well this works, and the enjoyment I actually get for seeing it slowly transform into a blue, I end up just jumping the gun, getting impatient, and using a few different paints to get started on where the glowing is, or the center of the staff will be. I do appreciate how well inks work, and we will come back to the inks later. However, in general, I kind of wish I would have stuck with this method, because it ends up looking really nice in the end. And here's where I get impatient, and I end up toning this down because it becomes a little bit too bright for what I wish, but I decide just to paint where I want the center to be, and then I can go out from there. I kind of wish I would have taken my time and were a little bit more patient with this. However, in the end, it still works out fairly nicely, but I just wish I had a little bit more patience. After I paint the area and let it dry, I do end up going back in with some other shades of blue to tone down and to get a nice blend. As you can see here, even more towards the center, I use a brighter shade of blue, so that it can be almost as if it were brighter towards the center and a little bit duller as you move further away. This is another example of layering and how you can use layering to make some really nice transitions and effects. And again, I come back with some more blue ink, tone it down a little bit, and get some of the other edges where I want the light to be radiating from. Around the sides of the staff, I put some blue lines, which eventually I will layer some more lighter shades on top of that to give kind of a crackling lightning effect. I think this turns out okay in the end, and while I wish it would have looked a little bit nicer, I am pretty happy for my first time actually trying this type of method out. One important aspect of layering is to use smaller and smaller amounts of paint, covering less and less area each time. If you cover the full amount of blue that you laid down first time, well, then you kind of defeat the point of the layering effect. Again, more of the blue ink to cover up some of the areas, tone it down a little bit, and then I eventually move further on down the staff to give it a lighting effect, and then eventually we'll move on to Thor's arm. It only takes just a few coats on the silver areas to show the blue lighting. Some areas I think I went a little bit too heavy because the staff wouldn't be that bright in contrast to the rest of the model, but it still gives off the idea that his staff is glowing and some of that light is spreading onto his body, which has a really nice effect. I do use a little bit of black wash to tone down the center, just a small amount. Again, just so it all seemingly looks a little bit more even and that it's a little bit more realistic. But the blue on his arm was very easy to apply. I just take some of the ink and brush on to where I want. If you find that the blue ink or any ink is a little bit too intense, you can thin it down with a little bit of water, and that will actually help out with your transparency and also tone it down just enough so that you can get what you want. The downside is you're going to need more time and also more layers. And with the staff complete, this is the main body of Thor done, and now we're going to get ready to start working on the head. And as you can see here, I already have the head primed and pinned, You can find that information on previous videos, but it's also very, very tiny. So before we go on to the head, you're probably wondering, how in the world do you paint something so tiny? Well, the answer is simple, and through some editing magic, we're going to find out. It's through something like these. So what these really are is essentially a type of magnifying glass that you wear on your head. Now, I got these off of Amazon for relatively inexpensive. I believe it was around $20, $25. And it comes with several different types of lenses that go from 1x all the way up to, I believe, 3.5. Now, personally, I don't like going up that high because then I have to hold the model very, very close to my face to be able to see what I'm doing. And if I'm holding something that close to my face, well, why even bother? But something like these, or magnifying glass, or really anything that can enhance your vision can be very, very useful for painting very, very tiny objects. One thing of note about these, especially for anyone who also wears glasses, they can be a little bit of a pain, and getting them to sit on your face without interfering with your glasses can be a little bit of a trick. Luckily, with some fiddling around, you can make it work. I can't wear these for too long, but hey. Makes me look kind of cool, right? All my good looks aside, I'm using brown leather, Kislev flesh, Cadian flesh tone, and Bugman's glow to paint Thor's head. I start off with the skin portions of his head using the Bugman's glow. I actually wish I would have done the brown hair and his beard first, but after I realized I made this mistake, I actually go back and apply the brown. One reason to do this is it's much easier to correct the flesh tone once all the brown is in place because it's a little bit more raised up. And then you are able to get into the corners a lot easier using the flesh tone as opposed to using the brown. And here I just add on the leather brown. I find it to be a very nice brown for most applications, though you can use any brown that you wish. And since I primed Thor's head black, it does take a few coats to get full opacity and for it to reach exactly where I want it to be. The glasses here actually provide a really nice help so I can get in close and not have to bend over as much to be able to see all the details. And then I use the Kislev flesh to do a little bit of highlighting, such as on the nose, the forehead, the top of the ears, and a little bit on the cheek area. Again, layering here works very, very well, and you can tell that it seems to blend together very nicely, especially when you're looking at it from a distance. I decided to give Thor a missing eye, kind of like at the end of the movie Thor Ragnarok. I think that's a really cool look. Also, it makes painting the second eye much, much easier. Because with that, now I only have to worry about one eye and where it's looking, as opposed to having both eyes trying to look in the same direction, or else we look kind of derpy. But I applied some of the red to the eye socket, and around the eye socket, as to that he was wounded and damaged in battle. After applying some black and some of the off-white for the center of the eye, I then go back in with my brightest flesh tone, and then outline areas such as the tip of the nose, tips of the ears, and a few other areas to show where the light would hit the most. And of course, much with most things I do, there's a little bit of touch-up work involved because some of the paint spills over. I end up trying to paint some highlights on the beard, realize they look terrible, and then I just go back and paint over it. Again, it's just paint. You can always just redo it. I go back in again the second time, finish up the highlights on the beard and the hair, and the head. He's looking pretty good. Now with the head on, the paint dry, add some basic materials, and zoom in for some glamour shots. There we go. Thor is now complete, finishing up the 3 first Avengers for 40k my way. I do plan on doing Hawkeye, Black Widow, and the Hulk in the future. I'm just not exactly sure when. There's a few other projects and ideas that I want to undertake first. But for now, I'm glad I got the first 3 done. I hope you enjoyed this video. At least something a little bit different, with a little bit less wash, and some OSL to brighten things up. If you're interested in some more mediocre action, I recently started up a Facebook group, just in case you want to know what I'm doing on days when I'm not filming or working. I also have an Instagram below if you are so inclined and care about what I do with really anything. Also, if you did like this video, I really would appreciate it if you give it a like, maybe even consider subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment below what your thoughts are. I really would like to hear about what you think, and also any type of feedback is great. And let's be honest, if you subscribe to my channel, it does give me a little bit of an ego boost. Well, that's it for now. Tune in again soon for some mediocre action. I've been Brian, this has been Mediocre Minis, and I shall return. Ah!